Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about letting go, not as an instruction, as an exploration. Lao Tzu, the ancient Taoist teacher, wrote in the Tao Te Ching, known in the West as the Tao Te Ching, that peace does not come from what we gain, it comes from what we are willing to release. That the mind crowded with holding has no room for what truly wants to arrive. Over these 13 chapters, we will explore a different angle of this teaching for each one. From the scholar who arrived already full, to the widow who confused her grief with her love, to the navigator who had mistaken a crossing for a possession, to the elder whose open hand became an invitation to everyone around her. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you're a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. These teachings are for anyone who has ever felt the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long and wondered if there was a gentler way to set it down. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. The Tao Te Ching, known in the West as the Tao Te Ching, opens with emptiness, not as a problem, as a gift. Lao Tzu wrote that a jar is useful because of the hollow space within it, that a room is useful not because of its four walls, but because of the empty space they enclose. He was pointing towards something that runs against the grain of almost everything we are taught about how to live well. We are taught to fill ourselves with knowledge, with achievement, with plans, with the reassurance that we have done enough, prepared enough, accumulated enough to be safe. Lao Tzu suggests the opposite, that the fullness we chase so tirelessly may be the very thing preventing us from receiving what we actually need, that peace, insight, and genuine rest do not struggle to enter a crowded mind. They simply find no room there. Tonight's first teaching is this. Before anything new can arrive, something old must be set down. The jar that is already full cannot receive a single drop more. The first act of wisdom is not adding, it is emptying. There was a scholar who had spent 30 years filling herself with knowledge. She had studied under every teacher she could find, traveled to every seat of learning within 3 months' journey, and filled more notebooks than she could carry without help. She knew the arguments of philosophers long dead, the histories of kingdoms that no longer existed, the medicinal properties of plants she had never actually touched. When her notebooks became too heavy to carry, she hired a boy to carry them for her. When she heard there was a teacher of great repute living in a mountain village to the north, she sent ahead to announce her arrival. She had a considerable reputation by now. She expected to be received accordingly. The teacher was an old woman who lived simply, who grew her own food, and who was said to speak very little. The scholar arrived in mid-afternoon, slightly out of breath from the climb, accompanied by the boy and his stack of notebooks. She sat across from the teacher at a low table and immediately began summarizing her studies, the traditions she had mastered, the arguments she had resolved, the questions she had come, finally, to ask. The teacher listened without expression. After some time, she stood and went to prepare tea. She returned with a pot and 2 cups. She began pouring tea into the scholar's cup. She poured until the cup was full. She kept pouring. Tea ran over the rim, across the table, and onto the scholar's robes. "What are you doing?" the scholar cried, standing up. "The cup is full. It cannot hold any more." The teacher set down the pot and looked at her visitor for the first time with something like directness. "Yes," she said. The scholar stood there, wet and confused, for a long moment. "You mean," she said slowly, "that I am the cup?" "You arrived here already full," the teacher said, "full of what you know and what you have decided and what you expect me to say. There is no room left for anything I might actually offer." "Then what do I do?" the scholar asked. "First," the teacher said, "you could change your robes." She smiled very slightly. She was not unkind. Later, after the scholar had dried herself and they sat quietly for a while without speaking, the teacher asked her a question. "When you were filling all those notebooks," she said, "what were you looking for?" The scholar thought about this seriously. She had not been asked this question before, or had never let herself sit with it long enough to answer honestly. "I think," she said at last, "I was looking for the thing that would finally make me feel like I knew enough." "And did any of it produce that feeling?" the teacher asked. "No," the scholar admitted. "Each thing I learned seemed to reveal 3 more things I did not know. Each teacher I studied under showed me the edge of their own understanding. I kept expecting the next notebook to be the one that finally settled the feeling." "And now you are here," the teacher said, "with all the notebooks, and the feeling is still present." "Yes." The teacher stood and began clearing the tea things. "There is only one thing that settles that feeling," she said, "and it is not more knowledge. It is the willingness to stop for a moment, needing to know more." The scholar stayed 3 days, which was not the length of time she had planned. She arrived expecting answers. She left with a question she had never thought to ask. What would it feel like to simply stop filling? She carried her notebooks home. She did not throw them away, but she left 2 of them behind, by accident or perhaps not entirely by accident, at the teacher's house. The teacher kept them. She did not read them. Years later, the scholar wrote a short book. It was the thinnest thing she had ever produced, barely 50 pages. People who had known her earlier work were surprised by it. There were none of the dense arguments they expected, none of the long chains of proof and counterproof. There were simply observations, short and clear, the kind that only become possible once a person has stopped trying to be impressive. The book became the thing she was remembered for. She was asked once what had changed in her writing after that trip north. She said she had finally learned the difference between knowing something and carrying it. Before, she had carried everything she knew at all times, certain she would need it. After, she had discovered that what she actually needed was almost always available in the moment she needed it, if she had not already exhausted herself carrying everything else. She also said, and this surprised people more than anything else she said, that she had been a better listener in the second half of her life. Not because she had become less knowledgeable, because she had become genuinely interested in what other people knew, in the spaces between the things she already had decided. "A full jar," she wrote in the book, "cannot be surprised, and it is the surprises that teach." The boy who had been carrying the notebooks noticed on the journey home that the scholar walked differently. He could not have said exactly how, only that she seemed lighter than she had on the way up, even though she was carrying just as much. Perhaps she was. In the Japanese Zen tradition, this same teaching about the full cup has been passed from teacher to student for many centuries. The most famous version of it is associated with the Zen master Nan-in, who used almost exactly this image, a visiting professor receiving tea that overflows the cup, to illustrate the same principle, that the mind already decided cannot receive a new teaching, however skillfully offered. But the Zen understanding of emptiness goes deeper than a single story. The concept of sunyata, emptiness, is central to Buddhist thought more broadly, and in Zen it becomes a direct practice rather than a philosophical idea. The Zen practitioner is not asked to understand emptiness intellectually. They are asked to experience it, sitting again and again, letting whatever arises in the mind simply pass through without being seized or held. This daily practice of emptying, returning each morning to the cushion, returning the mind again and again to bare presence, releasing whatever accumulated the day before, is understood not as an achievement, but as a continuous willingness. You do not empty the mind once and then possess the empty mind forever. You simply return each time to the willingness to let go of what has gathered since the last returning. A Zen saying sometimes offered to new students captures this directly. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The actions are identical. What changes is the quality of holding behind them, the willingness in each ordinary moment to be fully in it without clenching it into something to be possessed. The scholar's 3 days with the teacher was, in this sense, a tiny retreat in the Zen tradition, not because anything extraordinary happened, because she stopped adding long enough to notice what was already there beneath the fullness. Think about what you brought into this moment tonight, not physically, mentally. The unresolved conversation from this morning, the list of things you are holding in place for tomorrow. The faint background worry that you may have forgotten something important. The replay of a choice you made last week that you cannot quite set down. You may have felt this yourself, the way the mind arrives in bed still fully occupied, still managing, still carrying the entire day forward into the night as though the night required it. As though rest were something you had to manage your way into rather than simply allow. This shows up in ordinary life when you try to read or listen to something but cannot take it in because there is no room. Every sentence pushes against something already held there, waiting to be thought again. Not, but right now, in this breath, you do not have to carry your notebooks into sleep. Nothing you are holding in your mind tonight will be lost if you set it down for a few hours. It will be there in the morning, clearer once you have stopped gripping it. For just this moment, let the cup empty slightly. Let the thoughts you arrived with sit at the edge of the room rather than the center of it. You do not need to solve them. You do not need to plan for them. You only need to notice that you are holding them. And then, gently without force, Let your hand open. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of suffering that has nothing to do with what actually happened. It is the suffering that comes after, the replaying, the second-guessing, the wish that things had gone differently. The event is finished. The outcome has already arrived. And yet we carry it forward, day after day, as though continued holding might somehow change what has already been decided. Lao Tzu wrote that a person of Tao accomplishes but does not dwell, acts but does not cling to the results of acting. He was describing something very difficult, because the clinging feels like care, the replaying feels like learning, the wish it had gone differently feels like planning for next time. But there is a difference between genuinely learning from something and simply refusing to release it, between remembering and carrying, between glancing back and walking permanently backward. The river does not carry last week's rain with it. It moves. Whatever passed through has already passed through. The river is not poorer for having released it. Tonight's second teaching is this: releasing an outcome is not indifference to it. It is the willingness to let what is finished be finished, and to trust that what you gain from it is already part of you, whether or not you keep holding the vessel it arrived in. There was a woman who had spent 2 years preparing a ceremony for her community. The ceremony had been her idea. She had organized the gathering, arranged the offerings, invited the elders, and spent weeks in careful, detailed preparation. When the day finally came, it rained. A cold, driving rain that had not been forecast, that soaked through everything, that sent people running for shelter long before the ceremony was complete. She smiled through the day and said all the right things. But inside, something hardened. In the months that followed, she kept returning to it. Every time she drove past the ceremonial grounds, she felt the same tightening. Every time someone mentioned the rain that year, she heard it as a reference to her failure, whether or not it was intended that way. She began planning the next ceremony with a kind of grim intensity, certain that this time everything would be controlled perfectly, that she would not be caught again by something she had not prepared for. Her grandmother, who had led ceremonies herself for many decades, noticed this tightening without being asked. One morning she invited the woman to walk with her to the river that ran near their home. They stood for a while at the bank, watching the water move. "What happened to last winter's snow?" the grandmother asked. "It melted," the woman said, "ran into the river." "And where is it now?" The woman looked at the water. "Downstream, or evaporated, or in the sea by now." "Does the river seem diminished by having released it?" the grandmother asked. "No," the woman admitted, though she was not yet certain where this was going. "Does the river seem to be spending its energy trying to reclaim it?" her grandmother asked. There was a silence. "I have been standing in the same place for 2 years," the woman said at last, "watching the rain fall, over and over." "Yes, her grandmother said. "But I want to understand what went wrong," the woman said. "I want to make sure it doesn't happen the same way again. Is that not worth something?" "Of course," the grandmother said with genuine warmth. "Understand it. Learn what can be learned, that is honest and useful. I am not asking you to pretend nothing happened or that it did not matter. Then what are you asking?" "I am asking whether you have already finished the understanding and have simply not yet given yourself permission to set down the rest." Her grandmother looked at her steadily. "The understanding is yours. It lives in you now. But the rain, the ruined ceremony, the replaying of that day, those are not understanding anymore. Those are something else, something you are carrying long after the carrying has stopped serving you." The woman was quiet for a long while. "It feels like if I let it go," she said finally, "I am saying it did not matter, that all that preparation was nothing." "The preparation mattered," her grandmother said. "The ceremony mattered. The rain did not cancel the mattering. But mattering and carrying are not the same thing. The people who were there still remember it, despite the rain. Some of them remember it more clearly because of the rain. Something true happened in that place, even in the downpour. You do not need to keep holding the rain in order to keep the truth." They stood at the river a while longer. The water continued past them, unhurried, releasing each moment into the next without looking back. "What would it look like," the woman asked after a while, "to carry the memory of the ceremony without carrying the rain?" Her grandmother thought about this. "I think," she said, "it would look like being able to tell the story of that day with warmth, rather than with the original pain. Not pretending the day was easy, but being able to describe it eventually as something that happened, something that was disappointing and real, without the telling of it rearranging your face the way it does now." "Does it rearrange my face when I talk about it?" the woman asked. "Every time," her grandmother said, not unkindly. The woman returned to the ceremonial planning. Eventually, she was careful and thorough, as she had always been, but something was different. She prepared without the grim intensity. She made contingency plans without the desperation that had been behind them. When 2 years later it rained again on the day of the ceremony, a lighter rain this time, manageable, she simply adjusted without the tightening. Afterward, an elder thanked her for the grace with which she had handled the change in conditions. She thought of the river. She said only, "The ceremony was not the weather." Among many plains nations, including the Lakota people, there is a deep understanding of the relationship between what has passed and what is here now. Traditional mourning practices in many of these nations include periods of intense grief, followed by formal ceremonies of release, not because the person is forgotten, but because carrying grief beyond its proper season was understood to prevent the mourner from fully inhabiting the present. The release was not abandonment, it was an act of respect for life itself, for the living relationship that continued after the person was gone. There is a teaching about the way a river carries seeds downstream, not reluctantly, not anxiously, but as part of its nature. The river does not decide to release the seed when the time is right. Releasing is simply what the river does, continuously, without deliberation. The seed lands wherever it lands. The river does not follow it to monitor the outcome. This understanding extends in many Lakota teachings to outcomes more broadly. The hunt that did not succeed, the counsel that did not go the hoped-for way, the season that arrived with drought instead of rain. These things are acknowledged, learned from, mourned when mourning is called for, and then the river moves on. Not because nothing mattered, because the river is alive, and alive things continue. There is also a teaching sometimes offered about the way the same event can be described in two ways, as the thing that happened and as the story one tells about the thing that happened. The first is fixed. The second is a choice made repeatedly and can be remade. The grandmother in our story was offering her granddaughter this same understanding. The ceremony was real. The rain was real. Both are already downstream. The question is only whether you are moving with the river or standing still at the bank, watching the rain fall again. Think about something you are still carrying from a season that has already ended. Not something unresolved. Genuinely unfinished situations deserve attention. Something finished. Something that has already become what it is going to be, whose outcome you already know, but which you find yourself returning to again and again, replaying, re-wishing, redoing in your imagination toward a different conclusion. You may have felt this yourself. The way a finished conversation can remain more present than the one happening right now. The way a closed door can feel heavier than the open one directly in front of you. This shows up in ordinary life, in the moments when you catch yourself replaying what you said, or what was said to you, long after the exchange is finished. In the plans you make with a grim determination born not from genuine foresight, but from the wish that last time had gone differently. In the way you brace sometimes for a repetition of something that may never actually come again. Not but. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to revisit anything from today. The learning from it is already inside you. You do not need to keep holding the vessel. Let the water move past, the way it always has, releasing each moment into the next with the quiet confidence of something that trusts the current completely. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a grief that honors what was lost, and there is a grief that has slowly become a way of staying near it. Lao Tzu wrote very gently about loss. He understood that clinging is not always obvious. Sometimes it wears the face of loyalty. We hold on because setting down feels like betrayal, as though releasing the weight of something means releasing the thing itself. But the Tao Te does not confuse the weight with the love. It points again and again toward the distinction between what is truly ours and what we are simply carrying. A person can carry grief until it becomes the primary way they know themselves, until releasing it feels not like freedom, but like disappearance. Lao Tzu knew that this confusion is deeply human and does not require shame. It only requires, eventually, the willingness to see clearly that the love was real, that the loss was real, and that neither the love nor the person is contained inside the weight. The weight is not the memorial, it is simply what grief becomes when it is held beyond its proper season. Tonight's third teaching is this: setting down grief is not forgetting. It is the final act of love, the willingness to return to the living, carrying what the person gave you, without carrying the wound of their absence as though it were a duty. There was a widow who had been carrying her husband's absence for 7 years. He had died suddenly in the middle of an ordinary week, leaving behind 2 grown children, a house that still held his shoes by the door, and a woman who had organized her entire interior life around the fact of loving him. She had loved him well. 31 years. She did not regret a single year of it. But 7 years after his death, she was still wearing black, still refusing invitations to anything that might be described as joyful, still speaking of him in the present tense as though his absence were only a long trip. Her children worried, though gently and from a distance, the way adult children worry about parents who seem to be managing perfectly well, except for one thing. A woman from a distant city came to stay with her for a few weeks, an old friend, a person who had known both of them before they married. She had the particular authority that comes from having loved the absent person too. On her 3rd evening there, she asked the widow directly, "Do you think he would want this for you?" The widow's answer was immediate and certain. "No," she said, "he would be furious with me." "Then why?" the old friend asked. The widow was quiet for a long time. "Because," she said finally, "I think I am afraid that if I stop being a widow, if I stop carrying this in the way I have been carrying it, then I stop being the person he loved. The grief has become part of how I know myself in relation to him." The old friend sat with this seriously, without rushing to reassure her. "Tell me something he loved about you," she said at last. "Something that had nothing to do with your being his wife." The widow thought. "He loved my stubbornness," she said slowly, a reluctant smile moving across her face. "He said it drove him mad for the first 10 years, and then he realized it was the same quality that kept her going when anyone else would have quit. Is that quality still in you?" "Painfully so," the widow said. "What else?" She began listing, slowly at first and then with more ease, the things he had loved about her: the laugh that arrived without warning, the way she could talk to anyone, her complete inability to leave a book unfinished, her fierce, unreasonable love of the rain. "None of those things are grief," the old friend observed gently. The widow looked at her. "He loved you," the old friend said. "He did not love your grief. Your grief is the shape his absence left behind. But you are not the shape. You are the person he loved, still here, still stubbornly present, still laughing when the laugh arrives." "If I set it down," the widow said, "what do I become?" "What you have always been," her old friend said. "What he loved, which is not the same thing as the widow. The widow is only how the world has been describing you. It was never who you actually are." The widow wept then for a long while, in a way that felt different from the 7 years of maintained, dignified grief, more like something releasing than something held. She did not set it all down that evening. That is not how it works. But something loosened that night that had been fixed in place for 7 years. In the months that followed, there were mornings when the old grief returned in force, sharper than she had expected, given that something had released. Her old friend, who had stayed in contact, told her this was normal. "Setting down is not a single moment," she said. "It is more like learning a new habit of the hands. The old habit returns. You notice, you open again." She wore something other than black to breakfast the following morning, without planning to. She simply reached for a different color and only noticed what she had done when she was already at the table. Her old friend said nothing, only smiled. In the Sufi tradition of Islamic mysticism, grief is not avoided or suppressed. It is honored, and then in its proper time it is offered back to the divine as a form of surrender. The great Sufi poet Rumi, who wrote some of the most profound verses about loss in any language, was himself a person who had loved and lost deeply. His most celebrated work was written in the aftermath of losing his teacher and closest friend, Shams of Tabriz. The grief in those poems is not small or dignified. It is vast, searching, sometimes almost wild. And yet the same body of work contains a teaching about the movement from grief towards something the Sufis call fana, often translated as annihilation or dissolving, a kind of releasing so complete that the boundary between the mourner and the mourned begins to fade, and what remains is not absence, but a different kind of presence. There is also the image, common in Sufi poetry, of the moth drawn to the flame, not as a cautionary tale, but as a picture of love willing to be consumed entirely, rather than held back at a safe distance. The moth does not grieve the loss of itself in the fire. It was always moving toward exactly this. Sufi teachers use the image to suggest that some loves are meant to undo us a little, and that the undoing is not a tragedy to be prevented, but a doorway already built into the shape of loving deeply. Rumi did not say grief was wrong. He said it was a doorway. He said that the reeds crying for the river it was separated from is the very thing that makes it capable of music. The grief honored fully becomes the instrument through which something larger can move. There is a Sufi teaching about the difference between grief that moves and grief that stays. Both are real. Both are honored. But the grief that moves, that flows through and becomes in time something else, is understood as the more complete grief. The grief that stays is grief in the process of becoming armor. Think about something you have been carrying in the name of love or loyalty. Something you are afraid to set down because setting it down might feel like a betrayal. You may have felt this yourself, the way grief or regret or a particular version of a story about yourself can become a kind of identity. The way releasing it can feel like releasing the relationship it grew out of, even when the two things are entirely separate. This shows up in ordinary life in smaller ways, too. The self-criticism held on to long past the point of usefulness, because releasing it feels like excusing yourself. The old wound kept fresh, because the wound is the only evidence that something that mattered was real. The grudge maintained because setting it down feels like saying the injury was acceptable. The version of a relationship kept frozen in the shape it took at its worst moment, because updating the picture feels somehow disloyal to the pain. None of these are signs of weakness. They are signs of how seriously you took what happened. The question is only whether carrying them forward still serves you, or whether the love they were meant to honor can survive fully without the weight. But right now, in this breath, you are allowed to release something you have been carrying in the name of someone or something you loved. The love does not leave with it. Keep everything else. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Tao Te Ching about the name. Lao Jia opens with it. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. He is not being obscure. He is pointing at something precise. The labels we carry, our titles, our roles, our reputations, are not us. They are the shape the world has agreed to call us. Useful shapes often, but not the thing itself. We forget this. We begin to organize our entire interior lives around the defense and maintenance of a name. Lao Jia did not say names were worthless. He said they were provisional. He said the truest thing about you cannot be named, only lived, and that the person who knows this carries their name lightly, the way you carry something borrowed, aware, always, that it was never quite yours to keep. Tonight's fourth teaching is this: you are not your title, your reputation, your role, or the version of yourself other people are expecting to find. Setting down the weight of the name, even for one night, is not loss. It is rest. There was a king who had worn his crown for 40 years. He had been a capable king, not great, not terrible, but careful and fair. The kind of ruler whose people felt the absence of drama as a form of safety. He was known as measured. He was known as wise. He had spent 40 years becoming the king they expected, and most of the time he could not find the distinction between that performance and himself. When he grew old and his son was ready, he abdicated, gracefully, publicly, as he had done everything. And then he did not know who he was. He had a small house prepared for himself outside the capital, a garden, a few servants who had been with him for decades. He had imagined vaguely that this next chapter would be peaceful. He had not anticipated the particular vertigo of existing outside the role that had defined him for so long. He could not sleep. He sat in his garden at night and felt, underneath the quiet, something close to terror. Not fear of death or poverty or loss of respect. Fear of the blank space where the king had been. An old woman came to tend his garden 3 mornings a week. She was not deferential. She had been old when he was young and had outlasted several kings already and was not particularly impressed by any of them. One morning he was sitting in the garden when she arrived, and she studied him with the same direct attention she gave the plants. "You look like someone who has misplaced something," she said. "I think I have," he said. "What did you lose?" "I'm not certain," he said, "but I have been king for so long that I don't quite know what I am without it." She considered this while pruning a rose. "What were you before the crown?" she asked. He thought back. It had been so long. "A young man," he said, "uncertain, curious, afraid of making mistakes." "And before that, a child," he said, surprised by where this was going, "a boy who liked to climb trees and argued with his tutors and once cried for an entire afternoon because his dog died." "Is the boy still in you?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He sat with the question the way he had rarely sat with questions in 40 years of having to answer quickly. "Yes," he said at last, "I think so. I think I can still feel him, occasionally." "Then you have not lost anything essential," the old woman said, returning to the rose with her shears. "You have simply taken off a very heavy coat. The coat was real. It served you, but it was never you. And the boy who cried for his dog, and the young man who was uncertain, and the person sitting in this garden right now, these are much closer to what you actually are." "The coat served others as well," the king said. "People needed the king." "They needed what you did," she said, "not what you were called. The name king is just the agreement the world made about how to address the service you were providing. The service is over now. The name can go. You remain." "What do I do with what remains?" he asked. She looked at him with the direct, slightly impatient affection of a very old person for a very slow student. "Whatever you like," she said. "You're not the king any more." He thought about the trees. He thought about the tutors he had argued with and what he had been arguing for. Not obstinacy, but genuine questions. Questions that 40 years of kingship had slowly trained him to stop asking. He thought about the dog. He spent a quiet afternoon in the garden that day. He did not do anything remarkable. He looked at things. He had not looked at things without also managing them for a very long time. After some time, he found himself doing something he had not done in decades, simply sitting on the ground beneath an old tree with no purpose and no agenda, feeling the temperature of the soil beneath his palm. It was an unremarkable thing, the kind of thing a child does without thinking. He sat there until the light changed. He felt for the first time in, he could not say how many years, that nobody needed him to be anything at all, and that this was not emptiness, it was rest. In the Stoic tradition of ancient Rome and Greece, the distinction between what we are and what we are called was a central philosophical concern. Marcus Aurelius, who spent most of his adult life as emperor, wrote privately and repeatedly about the danger of confusing the role with the self. He reminded himself often in urgent terms, that the purple robe was not Marcus, that the title was not Marcus, that what he actually was existed somewhere beneath all of that and could only be reached by a kind of deliberate inward stripping away. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who had no title at all, who had in fact been a slave, taught that the person who mistakes their role for their self is enslaved in a different, more permanent way than any external condition can produce. To be a slave of one's own reputation, one's own need for a particular name to be honored, is to carry a prison that travels with you regardless of where you go. Seneca, writing to a friend late in his own life, made a related observation that we rehearse our titles and possessions before others as though reciting a part, and forget in the rehearsing that the part was always borrowed from circumstance rather than earned as identity. He advised setting aside time deliberately to imagine the loss of everything one is currently called, not to court despair, but to discover what remains once the recitation stops. The Stoics practiced something they called the view from above, a deliberate exercise of imagining one's life from a great distance, from which perspective all titles and roles become very small indeed, and what remains is simply a person, briefly alive, on a very large and indifferent earth. This practice was not meant to produce despair, it was meant to produce perspective, the particular freedom of the person who has held their own importance lightly enough that the removal of the title, when it comes, does not leave them without a self to inhabit. Think about the names you are carrying tonight, not the names on a document, the names you have been given by your life, the responsible one, the capable one, the difficult one, the one who always manages, the one who never asks for help. The role you carry into every room before you arrive. You may have felt this yourself. The particular exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that was never quite the whole picture. The version that is patient or together or competent or fine, the version that exists for the benefit of other people's comfort. This shows up in ordinary life in the moment you arrive home after a long day and the role follows you through the door, in the way you answer, "I'm fine," automatically, before you have even checked whether it is true. In the faint bewilderment of a quiet moment when there is nothing to be doing and no one to be for, and the silence feels stranger than it should. Not, but right now, in this breath, you are not required to be anything. Not the parent or the partner or the worker or the warrior, not the capable one or the struggling one. Just the person who existed before all those names were given, who still exists underneath all of them, who has never once needed the names to be entirely real. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a particular weight that comes from needing to be understood. Not just understood, understood correctly. The conversation replayed until the explanation comes out exactly right in our imagination. The defense prepared for a critique that may never be delivered. The explanation crafted in the mind long after the person who needed it has moved on. Lao Tzu wrote that those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. This is not a warning against ever saying anything. It is an observation about where the need to explain comes from, and what it costs. Most of the time, we are not explaining for the other person. We are explaining for ourselves. We are trying to close something that feels open, to resolve something that feels incomplete, to secure a verdict that will finally make the discomfort of being misunderstood go away. But misunderstanding does not close because we explain more carefully. It closes, if it closes at all, when both people have time and enough goodwill. And the explaining we do inside our own heads for an audience that is not there, that never closes anything. It only keeps the wound open longer. Tonight's fifth teaching is this. Releasing the need to be understood is not resignation. It is the recognition that you already know what you know, that the truth of it lives in you regardless of whether anyone else has ratified it, and that the exhausting work of explanation often costs more than it earns. There was a monk who had a gift for argument. He could trace a logical chain from any premise to any conclusion, and he had spent many years doing exactly this in the service of what he believed were important truths. Other monks came to him with difficult questions. He answered them thoroughly, sometimes for hours at a stretch, until the questioner either understood or gave up. He was proud of this gift, though he tried not to say so directly. One year, a new teacher arrived at the monastery who had a different style entirely. She asked questions more often than she answered them. When a student presented a view, she did not argue with it, or refine it, or trace its implications. She simply asked another question. Students sometimes left her company feeling that they had learned nothing, and then discovered weeks later that something had shifted. The argumentative monk found her presence faintly irritating. He could not have said exactly why. One evening after prayers, he made an argument about a fine point of doctrine, a topic he had thought carefully about for years. He stated his position clearly and waited to see what she would make of it. She listened. When he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. "Is it important to you," she asked, "that I agree with you?" He was surprised by the question. "It is important that the truth be recognized," he said carefully, "and if I do not recognize it, then I would want to explain more carefully," he said. "And if you explain more carefully and I still did not recognize it," he paused, "I would want to understand where the disagreement lies. And if you understood where the disagreement lay and resolved it, and I still did not recognize your truth?" He was quiet for longer this time. "I think," he said slowly, "I would find that very difficult to let go of." "Yes," she said, "I think you would." She was silent for a moment. Then, "May I ask you something? When you return to your cell at night, do you often rehearse arguments? Conversations that happened or that might happen?" He felt a flush of something close to embarrassment. "Sometimes," he said. "Is the arguing restful?" she asked. "No," he admitted. "Then I wonder," she said, "who is the arguing for at that hour in an empty room?" He sat with this for a long while. "I think," he said finally, "it is for the version of the other person that I carry inside my head, the one who has not yet been convinced." "And does that version ever become convinced?" she asked. "Never," he said. He said it with a kind of rueful surprise, as though this had not occurred to him before in quite these terms. "This imagined debater lives in your mind and carries your anxiety with it," she said. "It is not the actual person. It is a story you are telling about the argument, in which you are always the protagonist who has not yet won." The monk thought about the arguments he had been having in the privacy of his own head for years. Arguments with teachers from decades ago, with students who had questioned him in passing, with his own father who had died before the monk had finished explaining something important to him. "How do I stop?" he asked. "You notice," she said. "Each time the argument begins inside you, you notice that it has begun. You do not fight it. You simply recognize it for what it is, a story in which you are trying to secure a verdict that was never truly in the other person's keeping. And then you return to what is actually here." she said. This room, this breath, the fact that the truth you know is already in you, fully, regardless of whether anyone else has agreed to it tonight. He did not win every argument he started in his head in the weeks that followed, but he noticed them more often. And sometimes just noticing was enough to let the imaginary opponent quietly leave. He noticed something else, too, that surprised him. The arguments he did have, the real ones with real people, about matters of genuine importance, became sharper and clearer. Having released the habit of rehearsing for arguments that never happened, he had more energy available for the ones that did. He had assumed that his late-night mental debates were practice. He discovered they had been, instead, a drain. His sleep, over those weeks, was noticeably better. He mentioned this to no one. He thought that was probably right. In the Buddhist tradition, the need to be right is understood as a particularly subtle form of attachment, subtler than the attachment to pleasant things because it wears the disguise of principle. The Buddha taught extensively about what he called wrong views, but he was equally concerned about right views held too tightly. A view that becomes a fixed position, defended against all evidence and all questioning, ceases to function as wisdom and begins to function as armor. There is a teaching sometimes called the parable of the raft. The Dharma, the teaching itself, is like a raft used to cross a river. Once you have crossed the river, you do not carry the raft on your back. You leave it at the bank and continue on foot. A person who insists on carrying the raft has misunderstood the raft's purpose. The same is said of views, opinions, even correct understandings. They are tools for crossing. They are not the destination, and the person who has confused a useful view with an essential identity, who has built their sense of self around being the one who holds the correct position, will suffer every time the view is challenged, because the challenge feels like a threat not to the view, but to the person. There is also a more immediate teaching about the mind at night. The arguments the mind returns to in darkness are almost always arguments about something that has already happened, with a person who is not present to be persuaded. The recognition of this can itself be a doorway, not to silence necessarily, but to the question, who is this for? Think about an argument you have been having inside your own head, one that has no audience except you. You may have felt this yourself, the way certain conversations continue long after they ended, the other person entirely absent, while your side of the exchange grows more polished with every repetition. The email you could have written, the thing you should have said, the explanation you would give if you were ever actually asked, the rebuttal you have refined over many nights against a critique that may never actually come. This shows up in ordinary life in the quiet minutes before sleep, when the mind reaches not for rest but for rehearsal. In the way a misunderstanding can stay more present than all the understanding surrounding it, simply because it has not yet been resolved to your satisfaction. In the way you can win a disagreement entirely in the privacy of your own head and feel no different afterward than you did before you began. Notice, too, how much energy the rehearsing uses. It is not passive. The mind running an internal argument is working, spending genuine resources on a simulation that produces nothing, changes nothing, settles nothing. Not but. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to win anything. The truth you carry does not depend on tonight's verdict from the audience in your head. Let them go home. You are allowed to simply be here, in this breath, in this body, exactly as understood or misunderstood as you actually are. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Tao Te Ching about the garden that governs itself. Lao Tzu wrote that when nothing is done, nothing is left undone. He was pointing at the paradox of over-management, the way that certain kinds of control produce less of the outcome desired, not more. A garden over-pruned loses its wildness. A river over-redirected loses its knowing. A mind over-managed loses the space from which genuine insight arises. We think of control as protection, but there is a kind of protection that becomes the very thing it was meant to prevent, the holding on so tight that the thing being held cannot breathe. The desire to control is not shameful. It grows usually from love or from fear, both of which are real. We control because we care what happens. But caring what happens is not the same as being able to make it happen in the particular shape we have decided it must take. Lao Tzu knew that the wise gardener tends without dictating, clears without imposing, creates conditions and then stands back, trusting that what grows from honest soil and decent light will be worth growing. Tonight's sixth teaching is this. Some of the most important things in your life cannot be forced into shape. They can only be tended. And tending, at its wisest, includes the courage to let something be exactly what it is, rather than what you imagine. There was a gardener known throughout her valley for the discipline of her beds. Every plant had its place, every row was kept precisely. The weeds that dared appear were removed within hours of their arrival. She took pride in this control, and she had earned it. The garden was genuinely beautiful, disciplined in a way that expressed both skill and love. But 3 years running, her vegetables had produced less than the gardens of her neighbors. Her flowers were beautiful, but short-lived. And every spring she spent more time and energy maintaining the discipline than she had spent the year before. Her neighbor, an older woman whose garden was, by any conventional measure, a mess, grew the best tomatoes in the valley. Her paths were overgrown, her beds spilled into each other. Volunteers, plants that had seeded themselves without permission, were allowed to remain if they seemed to be thriving. The disciplined gardener could not ask her neighbor for advice without considerable effort to her pride, but the tomatoes made her do it. She walked over one morning and stood at the fence, looking at the comfortable chaos on the other side. "How do you do it?" she asked. The older woman, who was on her knees doing something with a trowel, looked up. "Do what?" "The tomatoes." The older woman looked at her garden thoughtfully. "I listen to it," she said. "What do you mean?" "I spend more time looking than doing," the older woman said. "I watch what wants to grow where. Some plants that volunteers, that I didn't plant, turn out to be exactly what a particular patch of soil needed. Some things I thought I needed to have in the garden, I've stopped fighting for. They didn't want to be there. Insisting only exhausted both of us. The disciplined gardener looked at her own perfect rose. But doesn't everything just become wild? Don't you lose control entirely? I've let go of control, but not of care, the older woman said. There's a difference. I still weed. I still water. I still stake the tomatoes when they need it. I just stopped assuming I knew better than the garden what the garden wanted to become. That sounds like giving up, the disciplined gardener said. I know it does, the older woman agreed. It felt that way at first, but then I noticed that the soil was doing better, that the plants were stronger, that I was less tired at the end of the day, and that the garden had more of something I couldn't name but could feel. A kind of aliveness that the perfect rose never quite had. What changed first? The disciplined gardener asked. How did you begin? I had a bad back one spring and couldn't do the usual round of weeding. I had to let the garden go for 3 weeks. I was certain it would be a disaster. When I finally got back out there, I found a volunteer borage plant had seeded itself right in the middle of the tomato bed. I nearly pulled it up, but something made me wait and look. The borage was keeping the pests off the tomatoes. The tomatoes were healthier than they'd ever been. She smiled. The garden was taking care of itself in a way I had never let it, because I was always too busy taking care of it for it. The disciplined gardener stood at the fence for a long time. She did not immediately change anything about her garden, but she began spending time in it differently, watching more, acting less, noticing what was happening before she moved to manage it. She pulled fewer weeds that first summer. Some of what she left turned out to be useless, but some of it turned out to be exactly what the garden was trying to tell her it needed, if only she had been willing to listen. Her tomatoes improved. Her flowers lasted longer. She worked fewer hours and spent more time sitting in the garden, simply noticing it, which was a thing she had not done in years, perhaps ever. She realized one afternoon that what had made her earliest seasons of gardening joyful before the discipline had become its own kind of obligation, was something very similar to what she was recovering now. She had, when she was young, not known enough to manage everything, and in that not knowing she had paid genuine attention. The joy had been the attention. The discipline had come in and, over years, replaced the attention with management. I became better at controlling the garden, she said to her neighbor one day, and stopped actually seeing it. The older woman, who was on her knees in a patch of volunteers, just nodded. In the Celtic wisdom tradition, the relationship between the human and the natural world is understood as reciprocal rather than hierarchical. The old Celtic understanding of sacred landscapes, the hill, the well, the particular wood, was not that these were resources to be managed, but presences to be listened to. A person who approached a sacred well with demands would find it dry. A person who approached it with openness might find exactly what was needed there, in a form they had not anticipated. There is a concept in Irish tradition, sometimes translated as the way things want to go, a recognition that land, like any living thing, has inclinations and directions that are not imposed from outside but arise from within. The wise farmer, the wise builder, the wise gardener understood this and worked with it rather than against it. This is not mysticism in the sense of requiring supernatural belief. It is a refined attentiveness to what is actually present, to the particular quality of a particular patch of soil, to what has thrived there before and what has consistently failed despite every effort to make it succeed. The Celtic teacher would have recognized the older gardener's approach immediately. Not chaos, not carelessness, the particular kind of attentiveness that requires setting down the assumption of already knowing and being genuinely willing to be taught by what is actually growing. Think about something you have been managing very tightly, out of care or fear, that may be trying to tell you something you have not yet been willing to hear. You may have felt this yourself. The relationship tended with such anxious, detailed attention that the other person can barely move. The creative project so perfectly planned that there is no room for the unexpected direction it keeps wanting to take. The emotion so carefully managed that it cannot actually move through and out. The schedule built so tightly around a child's day that there is no room left in it for the child to simply be bored, or curious, or briefly, harmlessly themselves. This shows up in ordinary life, in the exhaustion of the person who never lets anything be uncertain, who is always already preparing for the thing that might go wrong, who mistakes the activity of control for the safety of it, who has somewhere along the way confused loving a garden with ruling it. The disciplined gardener in our story did not become careless. She became attentive in a different way, a way that could actually receive what the garden was offering because she had finally stopped insisting it only offer what she had decided to grow. Not but. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to maintain any particular shape. Your mind is allowed to be slightly wild tonight. Not every thought that rises is a weed. Let the garden breathe. Let something arrive that you did not plan for. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is something the body already knows about letting go. The breath knows. Every exhale is a release, complete, unhesitating, trusting that the next breath will come without needing to be summoned by effort. We do not grip the exhale, trying to hold it in case the next breath is insufficient. We simply release, and the release is followed by the arrival of something new. Laodes wrote that life is a flowing movement. What he observed in water, he observed in breath, that the natural cycle of intake and release, when it flows unobstructed, sustains everything. And that the obstruction, the held breath, the held grief, the held opinion, is not safety. It is interruption. What is a sigh, after all, but the body correcting itself? The breath that had been held too long finally released, not because you decided to release it, but because the body knew instinctively that the holding had gone on long enough. Most of us, most of the time, do not actually control our breathing. We are breathed. The process runs itself, flawlessly, beneath the level of conscious supervision. We only begin to interfere with it when we become frightened or stressed or begin trying to manage it, at which point the breath, like the garden overmanaged, becomes less natural and more effortful. Tonight, we are paying attention to the breath. not controlling it, not improving it, simply noticing what it already does, perfectly, without your help, and asking what else in you might learn from it. Tonight's seventh teaching is this: the body is already practicing letting go many times each minute. The question is only whether the rest of you is willing to follow. There was a student of philosophy who could not sleep. This had been true for years. Not that she never slept. She slept eventually after considerable effort, having thought her way through every concern that presented itself and resolved as many as she could resolve before the exhaustion finally claimed her. She had tried many approaches: herbs, darkness, silence, counting. Nothing changed the fundamental experience. Sleep was something she had to work her way toward. She came to a teacher of breathing, a practice she had dismissed for years as insufficiently rigorous for someone of her intellectual training. She had arrived at last out of simple desperation. The teacher was a small, quiet man who began the first session by asking her to simply breathe normally and tell him what she noticed. She noticed a great deal. She described it in careful detail: the depth of each breath, the irregularity of the rhythm, the tension she could feel in her chest wall. "You are analyzing it," the teacher said. "I'm describing what I observe," she said. "You are observing with the part of you that analyzes. You are not yet simply breathing." She found this mildly infuriating. "I am breathing," she said. "I would not be here otherwise." "Your body is breathing," he agreed. "Your mind is examining. The examination is actually interfering with the breath slightly. You are, without noticing it, holding the exhale just a fraction too long, waiting to see what happens after it, rather than releasing it completely." She tried to feel what he was describing. She could not at first, but she stayed, and over the following weeks she began to detect something, a faint habitual tension she carried in the transition between one breath and the next. Not quite a holding, a slight reluctance to fully release. "Where does it come from?" she asked one day. "Most people who hold the exhale slightly," the teacher said, "are people who find it difficult to trust what comes after the release. The exhale represents an emptying, a small death, if you like, and the next breath, the inhale, cannot be guaranteed in advance. It simply comes reliably every time, but the moment of release is a moment of genuine uncertainty, and the mind that needs to manage everything tends to hold back from it." The student sat with this for a long time. "I am afraid of the gap," she said finally. "The moment after the exhale, before the inhale. The brief moment of being empty." "Yes," the teacher said, "and the only way through it is through it. Not by resolving the fear, by releasing the breath anyway, even with the fear, and discovering again and again that the next breath comes." She practiced this. She released the breath all the way, including the small extra fraction she had been holding back. The gap came, the next breath came, the gap came, the next breath came. Night after night, the same simple sequence, so reliable it eventually became something close to trust. She slept differently after that. Not because she had found a technique for sleep, but because she had discovered something in the body she had not known was available. The particular piece of a system that knows how to release completely and wait without anxiety for what comes next. She noticed over weeks of this practice that the gap itself changed. What had felt like a void, a moment of dangerous emptiness between one breath and the next, began to feel like a pause, then like a space, then eventually like something almost restful, the place after the release before the intake, brief and ordinary and, in its way, complete. She told the teacher, eventually, that the breath practice had not only improved her sleep, it had changed the way she held opinions. He smiled, unsurprised. "Yes," he said, "that often happens." "Why?" she asked. "Because the exhale and the opinion are the same thing," he said. "Both require the willingness to empty completely before something new can arrive." In the Hindu tradition, breath is not merely a physiological function. It is understood as prana, the life force itself, the animating energy that flows through all living things. The ancient practice of pranayama, the regulation and deepening of the breath, is built on an understanding of the breath as the link between the physical body and the subtler aspects of mind and spirit. When the breath is agitated, the mind is agitated. When the breath is held, something in the spirit is also held. When the breath releases completely, the whole system, physical, mental, spiritual, participates in that release. One of the foundational teachings of pranayama is that the exhale is more important than the inhale. The inhale is what the body naturally wants. It is the taking, the filling, the receiving. The exhale is the offering back, the surrender, the willingness to be empty. There is a teaching, sometimes offered to students who struggle with anxiety, that the exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the body's intelligence associated with rest, digestion, and recovery. To extend the exhale even slightly is to signal to the body that the danger has passed, that the holding can stop. This understanding extends, in Hindu philosophy, into a broader metaphysics, the breath as the microcosm of the universal cycle of creation and dissolution, of fullness and emptying, of the inhale of existence and the exhale of release. To breathe with full attention, in this view, is to participate consciously in the same rhythm that moves through everything. Try this now if you would like to. Take a breath, not a deep, forced one, just a normal breath. And when you exhale, let it go all the way, right to the end of it, the last little thread of air released completely. And then wait, without hurrying the next breath, for just a moment in that empty space. The next breath will come. It always does. You may have felt this yourself in the sigh that arrives unexpectedly, the breath your body took without asking your permission because the holding had become too much. The body correcting itself, the system releasing what needed releasing because the intelligence of it knows how. This shows up in ordinary life in the held breath before a difficult conversation, the shallow breathing of a day under pressure, the strange exhaustion of an evening when nothing particularly demanding happened, but something is still taut somewhere in the chest. The body carries the day in its own way, separately from the mind, and the exhale is its own form of setting down. Not but. Right now, in this breath, Your body is demonstrating the very teaching this entire evening has been circling. Release. Wait. Receive. Release again. It has been doing this your whole life, faithfully, without needing to be told. Tonight, let the rest of you follow its lead. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a particular kind of busyness that happens entirely inside the mind. No one sees it. It produces nothing. It changes nothing. It only exhausts the person doing it and fills the hours that might otherwise have been restful with a simulation of productivity that fools no one, least of all the person it belongs to. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage does not worry. He meant something specific, not that the sage is indifferent to difficulties or blind to real risks, but that the sage has learned to distinguish between attention and worry, between genuinely seeing a problem and returning to the same problem again and again, as though repetition might produce a solution that the first viewing did not. Worry, at bottom, is the refusal to accept that some things are beyond our knowing. It is the mind in the grip of uncertainty, trying to resolve the uncertainty by thinking hard enough, long enough, thoroughly enough, when the only actual resolution is time or action or the willingness to release what cannot yet be known. The Tao Te Ching is full of invitations to let the unknown be unknown, to stop demanding that the future declare itself in advance, to trust, not blindly, but simply, that what comes next will be met when it arrives. Tonight's 8th teaching is this: worry is not preparation. It is the exhausting practice of living in a future that has not happened, rather than the present one that has. There was a merchant who had built a comfortable business over many decades. He was not a greedy man or an anxious one by nature, but the business had grown large enough that real things could go wrong, and over the years he had developed a habit he was not fully conscious of. He carried his ledger with him everywhere, not the physical ledger which was kept safely in his office, but a mental version of it, constantly updated, constantly reviewed, running calculations in the background of every conversation, every meal, every moment that was supposed to be at rest. His wife noticed it first, then his children, then a business partner who had known him for 20 years. They described it differently, but they were all describing the same thing: a man who was present in body and somewhere else entirely in mind, always partially occupied with a calculation no one else could see. A rabbi in his community, whom he trusted and had known for many years, invited him to walk one Sabbath afternoon. The Sabbath was important to both of them, the day of rest, the day deliberately set apart from the ledger. They walked through the streets of the town in the afternoon, quiet. After some time, the rabbi said, "Where are you right now?" The merchant was surprised. "Here," he said, "with you." "And the figures from Thursday's shipment?" the rabbi asked. The merchant was quiet. "I notice," the rabbi said, with no judgment in his voice, "that when we are together like this, part of you is always elsewhere, in the warehouse or the accounts or next season's orders. I am trying to keep things in mind, the merchant said. I am responsible for many people. If I stop paying attention— On the Sabbath? The rabbi said gently. The Sabbath is one day, the merchant said. The problems do not pause. No, the rabbi agreed. But do they change in the hours you spend thinking about them? Do your calculations on a Saturday afternoon alter the outcome of the Thursday shipment? The merchant thought about this honestly. No, he admitted. Then what are you actually doing when you carry the ledger through your Sabbath? The merchant sat with this for a long while, watching a child play in a courtyard as they passed. I think, he said slowly, I am afraid that if I stop paying attention, something will slip past me that I could have prevented, that my rest is purchased at too high a price. But you said the calculations do not change the outcome, the rabbi said. So you are not actually preventing anything during these hours. You are only living in the fear that you might need to have been preventing something. That's right, the merchant said, and something in his face shifted as he heard himself say it. The ledger will be there on Sunday, the rabbi said. The problems that need your attention will still need it then. What is lost if you set the mental ledger down for one afternoon? Nothing, practically speaking, the merchant said. And what is gained? The merchant looked at the child, who was entirely absorbed in whatever game she was playing, unconcerned with anything beyond the immediate moment. A Sabbath, he said simply. The rabbi smiled, and they continued their walk. The afternoon opened around them. The sounds of the town, the smell of cooking from open windows, the particular quality of light on a late day when no accounts were being settled and no deliveries were being tracked. The merchant found himself looking at things, the texture of a wall, the way pigeons clustered on a roof across the street, a woman arranging flowers in a market stall with an unhurried attention he recognized suddenly as something he had not given to anything in a very long time. This is it, isn't it? He said to the rabbi. This is what the Sabbath is actually for. Yes, the rabbi said. Not only the rest from work, the return to noticing. He did not cure himself of the habit that afternoon. Habits of that depth are not cured in a single conversation. But he began to notice the carrying, to catch himself mid-calculation on a walk or a dinner, and ask himself the rabbi's question, does thinking about this right now change anything? And sometimes, when the answer was no, he was able to set the mental ledger down, even briefly. His wife noticed the change before he did. She told him one evening that he had been more present that month than at any time she could remember. He did not know whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. He settled on grateful. In the Hasidic tradition of Eastern European Judaism, there is a teaching about the nature of worry that speaks directly to this same recognition. The Hasidic masters taught that worry is, in a sense, a failure of trust. Not trust in any particular outcome, but in the underlying goodness of existence. They did not dismiss worry as trivial. They understood it as the place where faith and fear most directly meet, and they treated it with both compassion and gentle directness. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, is said to have taught that a person worries because they believe the world is unmanageable without their continuous mental supervision. That behind the worry is often a kind of arrogance disguised as responsibility, the conviction that if I think about this hard enough, I can control what happens next. There is a Hasidic practice of setting down one's concerns before prayer, not pretending they do not exist, but offering them up rather than continuing to carry them alone. The offering does not guarantee a particular outcome, but it shifts the relationship between the person and the concern from one of anxious ownership to one of shared holding. The merchant's Sabbath was, at its best, exactly this kind of offering, not the deletion of his concerns, the deliberate weekly decision to set them down for a few hours and trust that the world would not fall apart in his absence from the ledger. There is also a teaching sometimes offered in Hasidic circles about the nature of thought itself, that an anxious thought returns exactly as long as it is given full attention, and weakens slightly each time it is noticed and not followed, not suppressed, noticed. The noticing repeated is its own form of release. Think about what you are managing right now in the background of this moment. Not a crisis, just the low hum of ongoing concern, the things not yet resolved, the conversations not yet had, the outcomes not yet known. The mental ledger that runs quietly behind everything else. You may have felt this yourself, the faint impossibility of being fully present in any moment, because part of you is always already in the next one, always carrying something forward, always partially elsewhere. This shows up in ordinary life in the way a beautiful evening can be spent partly inside it and partly in the anticipation of tomorrow. The way a meal can be eaten while simultaneously planning the next step. The way you can be in a conversation while also being in a dozen potential future conversations about the same topic. Not, but, right now, in this breath, the calculations can pause. Nothing you are holding in your mind tonight will be solved by holding it. Set the mental ledger on the night table. It will be there in the morning. You do not need to stand guard over it. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a kind of fullness that comes not from accumulation, but from release. Not the release of grief or worry or identity, but the release of accumulated certainty. The fixed positions, the settled answers, the comfortable maps of how things are that were drawn long ago and have not been re-examined since. Lao Tzu wrote about the beginner's mind, the mind that approaches each moment as though it is genuinely new, which it always is. He wrote that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, while in the expert's mind there are few. This is not a criticism of expertise. Experience is real and valuable. But there is a particular danger in the expertise that has stopped being curious, that has decided the map is the territory, that has built its confidence on the absence of questions rather than the quality of its answers. The most dangerous thing to carry is not grief, or worry, or a name. It is the conviction that you have already understood, that you already know how this will go, that the territory can be anticipated in advance from the map you drew years ago, and therefore the territory itself does not need to be visited with genuine openness. Tonight's ninth teaching is this: the wisest person in any room is often the one still willing to be surprised. There was an elder who had spent 70 years learning to read the land. She could feel rain coming 3 days before it arrived. She knew by the behavior of certain birds when the dry season would turn. She could read the health of a river from its surface, not the color or level only, but something subtler, a quality of movement she had spent decades learning to perceive. She had passed this knowledge on to many younger people, and she was respected throughout the community for the depth of what she carried. At the age of 74, she went to live for a season with a community in a different part of the country, at the invitation of people who had heard of her skill and wanted to learn from her. She arrived confident. She was certain her knowledge was transferable, that the principles underlying the reading of one landscape would apply to another. Within the first week, she was quietly lost. Everything she knew about how land behaves in the country she had grown up in was wrong here. The birds she counted on to signal rain were absent. The rain itself came from a different direction. The rivers moved with a quality she had no language for. She sat with this disorientation for several days before going to the woman who had invited her, a younger person, perhaps 50, who knew this country the way the elder knew her own. "I am useless here," the elder said plainly. The younger woman shook her head. "You are not useless. You are a beginner." "I have not been a beginner since I was a child," the elder said. "I know," the younger woman said. "It is uncomfortable." "Very. What does it feel like?" The elder thought about this carefully. "It feels like humility," she said. "Not the humility of ceremony, the polite kind, the humility of genuine not knowing." "Yes," the younger woman said, "that is the real kind. Most people lose it as soon as they become competent at anything." "I did not know I had lost it," the elder admitted. "In my own country I can read everything. I had mistaken that ease for wisdom rather than familiarity." "They are not the same thing," the younger woman said gently. Over the following weeks, the elder unlearned her certainty and replaced it with genuine attention. She asked questions she would have been embarrassed to ask at home, among people who had always treated her as the one who knew. She was wrong about things, and said so. She noticed that this openness, this genuine not knowing, was producing a quality of perception she had not had in years, perhaps decades. She was seeing things with fresh eyes, because she had no choice but to use fresh eyes. She returned home a different kind of elder, not less knowledgeable. She carried everything she had ever learned about her own country intact, but she carried it differently, with an awareness of how particular it was, how specific to one place and season and way of seeing. She was less likely now to mistake her map for the territory. She was more likely to pause at the edge of something unfamiliar and simply look, the way she had looked in that other country before her certainty arrived and began directing the gaze. The elder walked home from that country with something she had not expected to bring back, a renewed interest in her own place that had nothing to do with her existing knowledge of it. She found herself noticing things in her home country that she had stopped noticing years ago, things that had been visible to her before she became the person who knew them and had then receded into background. A younger member of the community asked her some months later what she had learned on her visit to the southern country. She thought about the question seriously. "I learned how to learn," she said, which sounds obvious, but I had been doing something else for a long time. I had been applying, which is different. The younger people she taught after that noticed a change. They could not quite name it. The elder seemed equally knowledgeable, but somehow more open. She asked more questions. She was occasionally willing to say, "I don't know," about things within her own area of expertise, when honesty required it. They found this more reassuring somehow than her previous certainty had been. Among Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the relationship between knowledge and country is understood as deeply particular rather than universal. Knowledge in many Aboriginal traditions is understood as belonging to a specific place and community, passed down through specific lineages, tied to specific stories, relevant to specific country. This is not a limitation. It is a form of wisdom that resists the kind of totalizing certainty that comes from believing that what works here must work everywhere. There is a teaching present in various forms across many Aboriginal nations about the importance of approaching country, whether familiar or new, with genuine openness. Even in country you have known all your life, the teaching goes, you should arrive each morning as someone willing to be taught, because the country is alive and its teachings do not remain static. This is a form of epistemic humility, a recognition that knowledge is not simply a possession to be accumulated, but a living relationship to be continuously renewed. The elder who stops being a student of the country becomes, in this understanding, less of a teacher and more of a repository, holding what she learned but no longer genuinely listening for what is being offered now. Songlines themselves reflect this same principle. A songline is not a fixed record, memorized once and recited identically forever. It is walked, sung and renewed by each generation that travels it, and the country answers differently depending on the season, the rains, the particular attention of the person walking it that year. To treat a songline as a finished artifact rather than a living conversation is to miss what makes it a songline at all, something kept alive precisely because no one ever stops listening to it. The elder in our story recovered this quality in the most efficient possible way, by being placed somewhere she had no choice but to begin again. For most of us, we are not so fortunate. We have to choose the beginning, which is harder, but it is always possible, in any moment, to put on beginner's eyes, to arrive at something familiar as though for the first time, and find that it was always offering more than the expert's certainty had allowed us to receive. Think about something you are certain about, so certain that you have stopped actually looking at it. Not a belief in something you cannot know, something closer to home, a fixed opinion about a person in your life, formed years ago, maintained without revision. A way of approaching a problem at work that you never question because it has always worked well enough. A story about yourself that you accepted at some point and have not examined since. You may have felt this yourself, the faint discomfort of genuinely not knowing something you expected yourself to know. The resistance to beginner's mind in areas where you have worked hard to become competent. This shows up in ordinary life, in the way a long-held relationship can become a fixed set of expectations rather than a living encounter. In the way certain topics feel closed, not because they are resolved, but because the closure has become comfortable. In the faint pride of the person who has not been surprised about something in a long time. Not but. Right now, in this breath, you do not know exactly what tonight will bring. You do not know what tomorrow will actually feel like. Let that not knowing be something other than anxiety. Let it be, for just this moment, a kind of aliveness, the beginner's mind that is always available under the expert's certainty, waiting patiently to be recovered. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is suffering that comes from holding on to something that was always, in some sense, only borrowed. The life we have built, the body we inhabit, the people we love. Lao Tzu wrote that those who hold on to things do not truly possess them. What seems like ownership is often a temporary custodianship, something entrusted to us for a season, to be held lightly and eventually released. This is one of the deepest and most difficult teachings in the Tao Te, because it runs directly against the grain of how we think about love. We love people by holding them. We love places by returning to them. We love our own lives by insisting on their continuity. But Lao Tzu knew that the holding itself, when it becomes grasping, is the source of tremendous suffering. Not because love is wrong, because love and grasping are not the same thing, even though they can feel identical from the inside. The river does not own its water. The tree does not own its fruit. The hand does not own what it holds, only what it gently carries for the time being. Tonight's 10th teaching is this: to hold something lightly is not to love it less. It may be the deepest form of love, the willingness to let what is passing pass, with gratitude rather than grief. There was a navigator who had crossed the same stretch of ocean so many times that it had become, in his mind, his ocean. He knew every current, every swell pattern, every shoal that needed avoiding. He had navigated it in every season, in fair weather and in the kind of weather that strips a person down to their most essential decisions. He had come to love it with a particular intensity, the love of something known deeply across many years with genuine understanding. He also became, over time, somewhat proprietary about it. He gave directions to younger navigators with a tone that, without quite meaning to, suggested the ocean was his to explain. He corrected other navigators' accounts of certain passages with an authority that could edge into something less generous than expertise. His teacher, who was older still and had known this same stretch of water for even longer, noticed this and said nothing for several seasons. One morning they were sitting together on the beach, watching the sea. "The ocean was here before you," the teacher said, not unkindly. "Yes," the navigator agreed, uncertain where this was going. "And it will be here after you." "Obviously," the navigator said. "Then whose ocean is it?" The navigator looked at the water. It was doing what it always did, entirely indifferent to the question. Mine? In the sense that I know it, he said carefully. No, the teacher said. You know the part of it that was here when you were here. You know the seasons version, the decades version, the version that showed itself to your particular eyes and your particular attention. The ocean itself has never had any relationship with being known by you. It has simply been itself, and you have been a visitor who paid very close attention. The navigator was quiet for a long time. I think I have been treating it like a home, he said at last, when it was always in some sense a crossing. Yes, the teacher said, a very long and intimate crossing, but a crossing. Then what do I do with the knowledge? The navigator asked. If it was never mine, what do I carry? You carry the skill, the teacher said, and the gratitude, and the memory. These are genuinely yours. They live inside you, not inside the ocean. What you cannot take with you is the ocean itself. And the suffering comes from trying, from insisting that because you know it, you own it, from acting as though your knowledge of a thing gives you authority over the thing. The navigator thought of the younger navigators he had corrected. He thought of the tone he had used, the possessiveness in it. I have been treating other people's intimacy with this ocean as though it were a challenge to mine, he said. Yes, the teacher said, because you had confused the crossing with the territory. The navigator returned to his work with something loosened in him. He still corrected errors. When errors needed correcting, he did not become falsely humble. But the edge went out of the correction. He began describing his experience as his experience rather than the truth of the ocean. He became gradually easier to learn from, because learners could sense that he was offering knowledge without hoarding the source of it. A crossing done with full attention, he told them, and full gratitude, and full willingness to release it at the far shore, that is a complete crossing. There is nothing missing from it, even though you cannot keep the ocean. One of his students asked him once whether he was sad about this. He thought about it honestly. Sometimes, he said, particularly when I'm on water, I have known a long time and I feel the pull of wanting it to be mine. But then I remember what my teacher said, that the caring and the owning are different things. I can love this ocean with my whole attention and still let it be itself, which was never mine. The love, in fact, is truer for that. It is love of the thing as it actually is, not love of my idea of the thing. He was quiet for a moment. The ocean does not love me back, he said, but it does not need to. It simply is what it is, completely, and that turns out to be enough. In the wayfinding traditions of Polynesian navigators, the relationship between the navigator and the ocean is understood as reciprocal and temporary rather than possessive. The ocean is not a resource to be mastered, it is an ancestor to be respected, a presence to be read with humility, and ultimately a crossing to be made with full attention and full release at the far shore. Master navigators in many Pacific traditions spoke of receiving knowledge from the ocean rather than acquiring it. The distinction is important. Knowledge received is held in trust. Knowledge acquired is owned. And what is owned can be hoarded, protected, used to establish hierarchy. What is received can only be passed forward. There is a teaching, sometimes described in terms of the stars, that the navigator does not own the star paths, but learns to read them. And the star paths were used by those who came before and will be used by those who come after, and the navigator is only the current reader, the current grateful student of a text that was never written for them alone. This understanding creates a particular kind of humility in the finest navigators, not the false humility of diminishing their own hard-won skill, but the genuine humility of knowing that skill exists within a larger, older, more enduring context that will continue long after the individual navigator has made their final crossing. There is also a teaching about gratitude as the proper relationship to what was never yours to keep. In Polynesian traditions, the navigator who has completed a great crossing does not speak of it as his achievement alone. He speaks of the ocean that permitted the crossing, the ancestors who carried the knowledge, the stars that were patient enough to be readable. The skill is his. The crossing was shared. Think about something you have confused with ownership, something you hold and love, and have come to treat as though your knowing of it makes it yours in a way that it cannot actually be. You may have felt this yourself, the particular pain of watching something change that you had decided was fixed, a place that has been altered by time or development. A relationship that has grown into a different shape than the one you loved. A version of yourself that you have been trying to maintain past its natural season. Even a set of beliefs or ideas that once defined you and have since evolved. The grief of intellectual change is real and often overlooked. This shows up in ordinary life, in the moments when love becomes possessive, when caring for something tips into the need to control it, because releasing control feels like releasing the love itself. In the way a parent can mistake a grown child's independence for abandonment, when it was only ever the natural tide going out, the way tides do, with every intention of returning in some different form. Not, but. Right now, in this breath, you are in the middle of a crossing. You did not own yesterday, you do not own tomorrow. You have this moment, this particular, unrepeatable moment to hold lightly, to attend to completely, and eventually to release, with the navigator's knowledge that the crossing itself, fully made, is already whole. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a difference between a map that serves you and a map that holds you prisoner. A good map is made from accurate observation at a specific time in a specific place by a specific observer. It is useful then for traveling in that time and place. But landscapes change, seasons change, coastlines shift, and the map made in another era, however carefully drawn, begins, eventually, to mislead rather than guide. Lao Tzu wrote that the sage adapts, not from weakness or inconsistency, but from an accurate understanding of change as the fundamental fact of existence. The person who cannot release an old map, who insists on navigating present reality with a chart drawn in a past one, will find themselves heading confidently toward features that no longer exist. The maps we carry are not only geographical, they are the maps of how things work, how people behave, how the world is organized. Most of them were drawn when we were young, in different circumstances, by an observer who was a younger, less experienced version of ourselves. Some of them are still accurate. Some of them are decades out of date. The Tao 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 is full of invitations to notice when a map has become a prison. When certainty about how things are prevents you from seeing how they actually are. Tonight's 11th teaching is this: the map is not the territory, and releasing an outdated map is not disorientation, it is the first step toward actually seeing where you are. There was a chief who had led a coastal community through many seasons of change. He had been a good leader, prudent, experienced, with a memory that stretched back through several generations of his people's history in that place. He knew which coves to fish in which seasons. He knew which cliffs were unstable. He knew from decades of observation how the ice behaved in winter and how it retreated in spring. One year, the ice did not behave as it always had. It retreated earlier than any year in living memory. This changed the fishing, the travel routes, the timing of several important communal activities that had always been organized around the ice. The chief's mental map of the year, carefully maintained, deeply trusted, was no longer reliable. He spent the first months of this change insisting it was an anomaly. He organized activities according to the old timing. He advised the community based on the old patterns. He was certain that the season's deviation from his expectation was temporary. By the third year of the changed pattern, his certainty had begun to cost the community small but real things. Catches missed because the fish had moved with the ice, plans made against conditions that were no longer present. An old fisherman who had known him since childhood came to him in private. "You are navigating by a chart of the coast as it was," the fisherman said, "but the coast has moved." "I know what this coast is," the chief said. "You know what this coast was," the fisherman said. "For 30 years, that was the same thing. Now it is not." The chief was quiet. He had a great deal of pride invested in his knowledge of this place, this community, this environment. Setting down the old map meant, in some sense, admitting that what he knew was no longer sufficient. "I have led this community for 30 years, he said, "by this coast, by these waters, by this knowledge." "Yes," the old fisherman said, "and you should be proud of that. Your map was accurate for 30 years. That is a fine thing. But a map that was accurate for 30 years and is no longer accurate is not a monument. It is a liability." The chief sat with this for a long time. "If I set down the old map," he said, "I am admitting that I do not know where we are." "Yes," the fisherman said, "that is exactly right. And it is true. You do not currently know where you are, not in the full way you once did. But the person who does not know where they are and admits it can ask questions, can observe, can learn the new coast. The person who does not know where they are, but is certain that they do, knows nothing useful and cannot hear anything new." The chief made a decision that was not easy for him. He gathered the community's most experienced observers, people who had been paying attention to the changed patterns without the weight of authority that might have made their observations feel presumptuous. He asked them to teach him what they had seen. He listened for several long evenings without correcting or reframing. One of the observers, a young woman who had been watching the ice carefully for 3 years and had felt each year that her observations conflicted with the chief's certainty and were therefore probably wrong, was astonished to find herself being asked to speak. She had learned things about the new pattern that no one else in the community had articulated yet. The chief listened to her more carefully than she had ever been listened to before. She thought afterward that this had been the chief's real achievement, not the new plan they developed, the listening. He burned no actual maps. But the community saw something change in him that served them better than his certainty had, a leader who was genuinely curious about what was actually here, rather than what had always been. In the Norse mythological tradition, the relationship between order and chaos, knowledge and the unknown, is built into the very structure of the cosmos. The great world tree, Yggdrasil, holds the 9 worlds in relationship, but beneath its roots, Nidhogg, the great serpent, gnaws endlessly. And the worlds are not static. Ragnarok, the end of one cosmic cycle, is built into the Norse understanding of existence as an inevitable, necessary destruction from which new worlds emerge. What this mythology encodes in dramatic form is an understanding that no arrangement of things is permanent. The maps of the cosmos will eventually need to be redrawn. The gods themselves are not exempt from change, from limitation, from the eventual requirement to release what they have built. Odin, the chief of the Norse gods, is defined by this understanding. He sacrificed his eye for wisdom. He hung on the world tree for 9 days to receive the runes. He sought always to know more, because he understood with a clarity unusual for someone in his position that what he already knew was not sufficient, that the unknowable future required an ongoing willingness to update the map. Even Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, fly out across the 9 worlds each day and return each evening with fresh report of what is actually happening now, rather than what was true the day before. The wisest of the gods in this telling does not rule from memory. He rules from a map redrawn daily by messengers willing to go and look. A leader who consults a fixed record of the past in the Norse understanding is not wise. A leader who seeks always to know what is true now, even at personal cost, embodies the wisdom, the tradition most revered. There is also a Norse understanding of fate, represented by the Norns, 3 figures who weave the thread of destiny at the base of Yggdrasil, as something that cannot be known in advance and cannot be evaded through preparation alone. The wisest response to fate in this tradition is not to insist on predicting it, but to meet it clearly, with the eyes fully open to what is actually present rather than what was anticipated. Think about a map you are carrying that may no longer match the territory. Not a literal map, a mental one. A picture of how a relationship works that was drawn in a different phase of that relationship. A self-image that reflects who you were 10 years ago rather than who you are now. A model of how a particular situation operates that has not been updated since the situation itself changed. You may have felt this yourself, the odd double vision of sensing that something has changed, but finding it difficult to let the old picture go. because the old picture was real once and was earned, and carries the weight of years of accurate use. This shows up in ordinary life, in the surprise you feel when someone you have known a long time does something unexpected, and you realize the unexpected thing would have been entirely predictable if you had been updating your picture of them rather than maintaining the old one. In the moment, you realize the difficulty you are having in a situation is partly because you are trying to solve today's problem with yesterday's map, but arriving at the actual coast with fresh eyes, willing to see what is here now. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to know exactly where you are. You only need to be willing to look openly, without insisting that what you see must match what you already believed. Tonight is its own territory. You have never been here before. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel. Just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. A child learning to walk does not wait until they are certain they can balance before trying. They cannot wait. Certainty is not available in advance. The only way to know whether the body can do this is to attempt it. Imperfectly, in full sight of the possibility of falling. Lao Tzu wrote that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. People sometimes read this as an encouragement to begin ambitious projects, but there is another reading, that the step itself is the whole teaching, not the 1,000 miles, not the destination. The step taken without knowing exactly how the ground will receive it, taken in the full uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. This is one of the hardest forms of letting go, releasing the need to know the outcome before we commit to the action, the demand that certainty arrive first, that the path declare itself before we put our weight on it. The child does not demand this of walking. The seed does not demand this of the soil. The river does not demand this of the valley it has not yet reached. They simply proceed with whatever trust they have into the unknown of the next moment. Tonight's 12th teaching is this. The step is possible before the destination is guaranteed. It has always been. Every arrival you have ever made began with exactly this kind of not knowing. There was a young woman who wanted to leave her village and travel to the city to study medicine. She had wanted this for years. She had a quiet, burning clarity about it that had sustained her through the long seasons of an ordinary life in a small place. Medicine. She was certain of this. But she could not take the first step. She knew almost no one in the city. She did not know how she would pay for her studies, or where she would live, or whether the teachers there would take her seriously. She had made inquiries. Each inquiry had answered one question and produced 3 more. The path forward did not reveal itself fully, no matter how carefully she tried to see ahead. Her grandmother, who was very old and had seen many things, sat with her one evening as the sun went down. "Tell me what you are waiting for," the grandmother said. The young woman listed her uncertainties. It was a thorough and reasonable list. The grandmother listened to all of it. "When your father was born," she said, "did I know how to raise him?" "No," the young woman said, surprised. "How would you have?" I did not, the grandmother agreed. I had never raised a child before. I did not know whether I had the qualities it required. I did not know whether he would be easy or difficult, healthy or sick, whether I would make the right decisions at the moments that mattered. I knew almost nothing in advance. But you did it anyway, the young woman said. I took the first step, the grandmother said, and then I took the next one. And the answers to the questions I had in advance came as I needed them, not before. What if they hadn't? The young woman asked. What if the answers hadn't come? Then I would have faced that when I faced it, the grandmother said simply. But they did come, not as a gift, as a consequence of being in the situation rather than thinking about the situation from a safe distance. You make it sound easy, the young woman said, not unkindly. It is not easy, the grandmother said. It is just the only way it actually works. You are looking for a path that is fully lit before you start walking. But paths do not light themselves in advance. They light themselves under your feet, one step at a time, as your weight falls on them. What if I fall? The young woman asked. You will fall, the grandmother said. Probably several times. Falling is not the failure. Staying still because you were afraid of falling is the failure. The child who never tries to walk because falling is possible never walks. The young woman left for the city the following spring. The path was exactly as unclear as it had looked from a distance. She found lodging through connections she had not anticipated making. She paid for her first year's study through means she could not have predicted. She fell, several times, in ways that were painful and some of which required considerable recovery. She became a doctor, a good one. When young people came to her years later with their own anxious lists of uncertainties, she would listen to all of it and then say something her grandmother had told her, which she had found, against all expectation, to be true. The path lights itself under your feet, but only when you are actually walking. She noticed over the years that the patients who recovered best were not always those whose prognosis was clearest. They were often the ones who had some capacity to live inside uncertainty without needing to resolve it, who could act even without a guarantee because they understood somehow that guarantees were not on offer and never had been. She called this, privately, the ability to take the first step. She tried to teach it when she could, alongside the medicine. In the Mayan cosmological tradition, time is understood not as a line, but as a series of cycles, each with its own energy and character, each arriving and departing in its own season. The ancient Maya observed that certain things are appropriate to certain times, not because humans decide this, but because the cycle itself carries a particular quality that makes certain actions more likely to bear fruit than others. A seed planted in the wrong season does not become the planting's fault. It is simply the wrong season. What this tradition understood about timing and right action is relevant to the young woman's paralysis. The demand for certainty before acting often comes from the mistaken belief that if we wait long enough, the right season will announce itself so clearly that risk will disappear. But seasons do not eliminate risk. They simply shift the odds. And the person who waits for risk to disappear entirely will wait forever. There is a teaching carried in Mayan ceremonial traditions about the planting of the first corn, a ritual act performed not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the planting is itself an act of trust in the cycle. The farmer who plants is not certain of the harvest. They are faithful to the season. and faithfulness to the season, season after season, is what produces, over time, the skill to read the seasons accurately, and eventually the harvest. The young woman's first step was her planting. The harvest was not guaranteed, but the planting was necessary before the harvest was even possible. And the grandmother understood something else too, that a person who has never planted will never develop the skill of the planting, which only grows through the repeated experience of committing to the soil, not through the study of planting from a safe distance. In this tradition, the act of beginning, even without certainty, even in the face of risk, is itself understood as wisdom, not recklessness, the willingness to enter the cycle, to become part of it rather than observing it anxiously from outside. Think about something you are waiting to know before you begin. Not something that genuinely requires research or preparation. There are real things that benefit from careful thought. But something you have been waiting on for longer than the waiting is actually useful. Something whose uncertainty has become a reason not to move, long past the point where more information would have genuinely helped. You may have felt this yourself. The peculiar paralysis of a decision so carefully considered that it has looped back into a kind of fog, where more thinking produces not more clarity but more complexity. This shows up in ordinary life, in the plans that never quite get started. The conversation always deferred until conditions are better. The change wanted for years, but postponed into an indefinite future in which all the uncertainties have somehow resolved themselves. The doctor who calls this the paralysis of analysis. The grandmother who called it standing in the garden, studying seeds rather than putting them in the ground. Not but. Right now, in this breath, you do not need to know what tomorrow will look like. You do not need to know how things will turn out. You only need to be here, in this moment, where the path is as lit as it needs to be, lit exactly as far as the next breath. That has always been enough. It is enough tonight. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. We have arrived across these 13 chapters at the teaching beneath all the others. Not a new teaching, the one that has been present from the beginning, in different words, through different stories, wearing the face of a scholar at a tea table, a widow setting down her grief, a child taking a first step. Lao Tzu described this teaching in the Tao Te Ching with an image so simple it is easy to overlook. He wrote about the open hand, not the closed fist, gripping what it fears to lose, not the reaching hand, grasping toward what it does not yet have. The hand that rests open in the lap, neither holding nor seeking, simply present. This is the image of a person who has released what needed releasing. The outcomes, the identities, the explanations, the worries, the certainties that were no longer accurate. Not because they no longer care, because they have discovered over time and through practice that caring and gripping are not the same thing. The open hand can feel what it holds, the closed fist cannot. The open hand can receive what arrives, the closed fist is already full. Tonight's final teaching is this: peace is not the absence of difficulty. It is what becomes possible when the hand finally opens. There was a village elder who was known throughout the region for something people struggled to describe precisely. They said she was wise, but that word did not quite capture it. They said she was kind, but many people were kind. What she had was something quieter, a quality of presence that made people feel in her company that they did not need to perform anything, that whatever they had brought with them was acceptable, that the weight they carried could be set down for a while without judgment or consequence. People came to her with their difficulties. She did not solve many of them directly. She listened. Sometimes she asked a question that shifted the angle of the thing. Sometimes she simply sat with someone for a long while without saying anything, and the person left feeling lighter than they had arrived, without being able to point to exactly what had changed. A young woman came to her once, a person new to the village, carrying a great deal of accumulated weight from a life that had been more difficult than most. She came because she had heard the elder was worth talking to, though she had no specific question and was uncertain what she expected. They sat together in the elder's small house. The elder prepared tea. She did not ask the young woman what had brought her. She simply waited, with the particular quality of waiting that felt like genuine availability rather than polite endurance. After a long silence, the young woman said, "I don't know what I'm holding on to anymore. I just know I'm very tired." "Yes," the elder said, "that is how it feels when you have been carrying things for a long time. The individual items stop being identifiable. It all becomes one weight." "How do I put it down?" the young woman asked. "You begin with the hand," the elder said. "What do you mean?" "Open your hand," the elder said. The young woman looked down. Her hands were in her lap, loosely closed, not fists, just hands at rest in the habit of the slightly closed. She opened them, palms upward. "Look at that," the elder said, "without doing anything more. Just look at the open hand." The young woman looked at her own open palms. "When the hand is open," the elder said, "it cannot grip. And when it cannot grip, the weight has nowhere to attach. It does not mean the weight disappears immediately, but the relationship between you and it changes." "It's still there," the young woman said. "The tired feeling is still there." "Yes," the elder agreed. "Opening the hand does not remove what you have been carrying. It changes your relationship to it. The closed hand insists on keeping it. The open hand says, 'I am holding this, but I am not required to hold it. I can release it when the time comes, or I can continue holding it, but now by choice, not by habit.'" The young woman sat with open hands for a while. "There is a lot I don't know how to let go of," she said. "I know," the elder said. "Most of it cannot be let go of all at once. It comes loose gradually in seasons. But the open hand is how all of it begins." "What do I do between now and when it comes loose?" the young woman asked. "You practice the open hand," the elder said, "not as a metaphor only. Literally. When you notice yourself gripping your hands, your jaw, your chest, any of the places the body holds what the mind cannot, you open, you notice, you soften, each time, not to force the weight to leave, only to stop insisting that particular moment that it must stay. The young woman came back many times over the following years. She did not come with solved problems. She came in the way that people returned to a place that had given them something genuinely useful, not for more of the same thing, but because the place itself had a quality worth returning to. The elder died at a great age, as elders do when they are fortunate. The young woman, who was no longer so young by then, sat by her bed in the final days and held the elder's hand. It was open in sleep, in the particular effortless way that bodies find when they have finally stopped gripping. She thought about everything she had released over the years, and about everything she was still carrying, and might always carry to some degree, and about how, somehow, the carrying had become lighter, not because the weight had all left, but because the hand that held it had learned over many seasons to hold it a little more loosely. She returned home that evening and found herself, without planning it, sitting in the same position she had sat in at the elder's house all those years ago. Quiet, hands open, not achieving anything, not resolving anything, simply present, in the way the elder had always been present, which had always felt, from the outside, like the simplest possible thing, and was in fact the work of a lifetime. In the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the quality the elder possessed, the quality that made people feel seen and accepted in her presence, has a name. Ubuntu is often translated as "I am because we are." But there is a dimension of it that touches directly on what we have been exploring all evening, the understanding that a person is not complete as an isolated individual holding everything alone, but becomes most fully themselves in genuine connection with others. In Ubuntu thinking, the elder's open presence, the fact that people could set down their weight in her company, was not merely her personal gift. It was the expression of a deeply communal understanding of what human presence is for. A person who holds everything closed, who is inaccessible behind their own accumulated weight, cannot fully participate in the web of mutual sustaining that Ubuntu describes. The openness was, in this sense, an act of community. By releasing her own need to perform or manage or grip, she created a space in which other people could also release. Her open hand was an invitation to other hands to open. There is a teaching sometimes offered in Ubuntu contexts about the elder whose presence benefits the whole village, not through specific actions or knowledge alone, but through a quality of being that is itself a gift. This quality is not achieved, it is arrived at gradually through the willingness to release, through becoming, over time, less dense with accumulated weight, more available to what is actually here. Ubuntu also holds that this quality, once developed in one person, spreads, not through instruction, but through contact. The village that has an elder who is genuinely opened becomes, over time, a village that knows what openness feels like, and recognizes it, and seeks it, and gradually learns to practice it themselves. Open your hand if you would like to. Wherever it rests right now, against your side, beneath the pillow at the edge of sleep, let it open. Not dramatically, just the natural opening of a hand that has stopped gripping. Notice what happens in the rest of the body when one hand opens. Sometimes the jaw loosens slightly, sometimes the chest softens, sometimes the breath deepens a fraction without being invited to. This is the body's wisdom, the same wisdom the elder practiced, the same wisdom Lauder described thousands of years ago in a short book written at the edge of a mountain. The open hand is not passive. It is the most active form of release available to you, a signal from the body that the gripping can stop, at least for now, at least for tonight. You have been carrying a great deal. Over the course of this evening, we have named some of what gets carried, the old outcomes, the identities, the arguments, the worries, the certainties, the grief. You have not been asked to resolve any of it or delete any of it, only to hold it a little more loosely, only to practice here the beginning of the open hand. But right now, in this breath, you have arrived somewhere, not a destination, a moment, this open hand, this quiet that was always here beneath everything you have been carrying. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight, we began with the jar that was already full. And over these 13 chapters, we let the question of letting go open slowly from many different sides. We watched a scholar arrive at a teacher's house full of notebooks and leave lighter, though carrying the same weight. We stood at the bank of a river with a woman who had been holding last year's rain for 2 years. We sat with a widow who had confused the weight of grief with loyalty to love. We watched a king discover in a garden who he had been before he was ever called a king. We followed a monk who learned that the arguments he was winning at midnight had no audience but himself. We crouched in a garden that was trying to teach its keeper something it was not allowed to because she was too busy keeping it. We listened to a student discover in a single full exhale what the body already knew about releasing. We walked through a Sabbath afternoon with a merchant who had never left the ledger behind. We sat with an elder who had to become a beginner again to remember what learning actually felt like. We stood at the shore with a navigator who had loved an ocean he was never going to own. We watched a chief burn, not his actual maps, but the certainty behind them. We listened to a grandmother tell her granddaughter that the path lights itself under the feet, not in advance. And finally we sat with an elder whose open hand was itself the teaching. Now let us be clear about something. You are not the notebook. You are not the worry you carried into this room. You are not the rain from last season, or the ledger, or the name that was given to you decades ago and has been sitting on your shoulders ever since. You are not the argument still running in the background. You are not the outcome you have been refusing to release. You are not the map you drew in a younger year of a territory that has since shifted. You are the one who has been listening. You are the awareness underneath all of that carrying. You are the quiet that was present before any of it began, and that will remain unchanged once the carrying is finally, gradually set down. A teaching that has been offered tonight in 13 voices from 13 different corners of the world is simply this. Lao Tzu wrote it plainly thousands of years ago in 81 short passages that people are still reading, still returning to, still finding new. Our suffering does not come primarily from what happens to us. It comes from how tightly we hold on to it afterward. And the peace that the Tao Te Ching points toward is not a peace achieved through accumulation or effort or the perfect resolution of every difficulty. It is a peace that enters gradually, gently, reliably into the space that opens when we finally, at last, loosen the grip. This is not mastered once. The scholar goes home and fills more notebooks. The widow has difficult mornings. The navigator catches himself now and then talking about the ocean as though it belongs to him. The teaching does not ask for perfection. It asks for returning again and again to the open hand, again and again to the breath that releases completely, again and again to the recognition that what you need was never located inside the weight. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, one phrase, one feeling, one particular image of the hand or the river or the child taking the first uncertain step, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.